I was standing at the podium reading my mother's eulogy when my phone buzzed with a notification that shattered whatever strength I had left. It was from my new CEO. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. No reason, no warning. Just a message sent while I stood beside my mother's urn. That's the moment everything changed. He thought he was cutting costs. He had no idea he'd just fired the daughter of Solyra's co-founder and the woman who secretly controlled his fate. Stay until the end and tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place? I never imagined grief could have a sound until that morning. The quiet hum of the livestream equipment, the soft whisper of rain against the stained glass windows, the static in the microphone as I read my mother's eulogy to hundreds of faces watching from their screens. She'd been gone only 6 days, but I already felt hollow, like someone had scooped out the part of me that used to believe in mercy. My mother had built the foundation of Solyra Dynamics beside my father decades ago, back when the company still meant something human. And now, here I was, standing in the echo of everything she'd sacrificed, saying goodbye to the only person who had ever taught me that integrity mattered more than ambition. When the service ended, I sat down in the front pew, numb, fingers trembling against the folded speech in my lap. The smell of lilies and polished wood made it hard to breathe. I'd silenced my phone earlier, but a faint vibration from my bag broke through the hush. 1, then 2, then a stream, persistent, mechanical. I thought maybe it was distant family sending condolences, or another board member checking in out of politeness. I ignored it, staring at my mother's urn, a small white vessel on the altar surrounded by roses she would have hated because they bruised so easily. Then the vibration turned into a harsh buzz. I pulled out my phone without thinking. The subject line on the email stopped my heartbeat. Employment termination notice. For a second, my eyes refused to focus. I blinked once, twice, and the words stayed there: clinical, corporate, heartless. I opened it. A message from Victor Crane, the new CEO, time-stamped 11:14 a.m., the exact moment I'd been reading the final line of my mother's speech. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated due to unavailability during critical transition periods. Security will coordinate retrieval of company property. The world tilted. My mouth went dry. My body forgot how to exist. Fired at my mother's memorial. My breath caught in my throat and the edges of the chapel blurred. Ethan's hand was suddenly on my shoulder, his whisper tight and urgent. Aria, what happened? I couldn't answer. I just handed him the phone. He read it once, then again, his jaw tightening with disbelief. This can't be real. Today? He fired you today? The outrage in his voice was like a match striking oxygen, sharp enough to jolt me back into myself. Around us, people were beginning to stand, gathering coats, whispering condolences they didn't mean. I felt their eyes flick toward me as Ethan muttered curses under his breath. I wanted to vanish. Instead, I stood, smoothing the fabric of my black dress, pretending control I didn't feel. My knees nearly buckled as I walked toward the exit, my mother's face framed on a memorial screen behind me. Outside, the rain had turned to a cold mist that clung to everything. I stood beneath the portico, staring at the message glowing on my phone, each word cutting deeper. Unavailability. Critical transition periods, as if burying my mother were an inconvenience, as if 12 years of loyalty, 60-hour weeks, and missed holidays meant nothing because I had dared to grieve. I felt humiliated, stripped of dignity in the most public way possible. I wanted to scream, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, something colder began to rise, an awareness that this moment, this cruelty, would define everything that came next. I stared out at the street where the hearse had just driven away, and a strange calm took over. The part of me that used to flinch was gone. Whatever weakness grief had carved into me, it had also created something sharper. My mother had once said, "When someone shows you what they value, don't argue, just take note." Victor Crane had just shown me everything I needed to know. The drive home felt longer than any road I'd ever taken. The windshield wipers kept time with the hollow rhythm inside my chest. Ethan sat beside me, his silence heavy, his hand gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every few miles, he'd shake his head like he was still trying to believe what had happened. "It's illegal, Aria," he muttered finally. "Bereavement leave is protected. You could take him to court." I stared out the window, watching water trail down the glass like veins of thought. "I could," I said, "but lawsuits take years. He knows that." Victor Crane counted on people being too broken, too tired to fight. I had seen it happen before. Colleagues quietly erased, settlements sealed, stories forgotten. But this time, it wasn't going to fade quietly. The message replayed in my head, not as pain now, but as a pattern. Words like unavailability and transition periods weren't random. They were legal scaffolding, the language of justification. Someone had planned this. That was what made the anger feel clean, because it was no longer just grief. It was recognition. By the time we pulled into the driveway, something inside me had shifted from shock to focus. The house still smelled like lilies from the funeral, a scent that used to comfort me, but now just felt like residue from another life. Ethan followed me into the kitchen, already pulling out his laptop. "We can draft a claim tonight," he said. "I'll find the best employment. Lawyer in Seattle." His need to fix things was familiar, endearing even, but I shook my head. "This isn't about the law anymore. It's about principle, about power." He looked up, confused. "Power?" I took a deep breath, walked past him, and opened the small cabinet above the refrigerator where I kept personal files, things even he hadn't touched. Inside was a black folder marked Harmon Holdings. My father's handwriting was still visible on the first page. "He left this for me," I said quietly. "When he died, I inherited his shares, but I never used them. I stayed silent because he asked me to, unless leadership proved unworthy." I set the folder on the counter, my fingers steady for the first time all day. "Well, I think today qualifies." Ethan blinked. "Wait, how many shares?" 41.7%, I said, "enough to ruin him if I choose." He stared at me like I'd just confessed to something dangerous. Maybe I had, but the truth felt strangely liberating. My grief hadn't vanished. It had evolved. The helplessness of the morning had hardened into direction, purpose shaped by betrayal. For years I had built that company's backbone, strategic plans, acquisitions, data integrations, while men like Victor used my work as their stepping stones. Now, one impulsive act of cruelty had given me the moral leverage to take everything back. I opened my laptop, the glow from the screen lighting the paper spread across the table. Ethan's voice softened. "What are you doing?" "Research," I said. "I need to see how far he's reached, who's complicit, and how fast he's moving." My inbox was already filling with messages from colleagues, half confusion, half fear. The new CEO's restructuring had begun that morning. I scrolled through the internal bulletins, reading names of people laid off while attending my mother's service. The timing wasn't coincidence, it was choreography. Victor Crane was clearing the board, consolidating control, but he'd miscalculated one thing. He didn't know who still owned the game. I spent most of that night sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the glow of my laptop. The funeral flowers on the counter had begun to wilt, their petals curling inward like tired lungs. I pulled up Solyra Dynamics shareholder registry and entered my credentials, fingers steady despite the tremor beneath my skin. There it was in clean white numbers, 41.7%. My father's legacy distilled into equity and influence. For 12 years I had treated it like a relic, not a weapon. I'd believed leadership meant patience, not confrontation, but that belief had died with my mother. My father, Aria Monroe, had been Solyra's heart long before it became a global AI analytics powerhouse. He was an engineer with a poet's soul, the kind of man who believed technology could serve humanity, not consume it. He founded the company with two friends in a rented basement and built it around the principle that ethical innovation could still be profitable. When he passed, he left me two things: his shares and a letter sealed in an envelope. I had read it once years ago and couldn't bear to look again until now. I unfolded it slowly, the ink faint but clear. Aria, it began, when this company forgets that people matter more than numbers, you'll know what to do. There was no ambiguity, no instruction manual, just faith that I would recognize the moment. Tonight, that moment had arrived. I reread his words until the anger that had been burning inside me reshaped into precision. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about correction. Solyra had been hijacked by the kind of leadership my father despised, the kind that weaponized metrics to excuse cruelty. Victor Crane was not an innovator. He was a vulture disguised in a tailored suit, sent to strip Solyra for parts. I opened his corporate biography, scrolling through the familiar pattern. McKinsey consultant, Harvard MBA, turnaround specialist, short tenures at 3 major firms, all of which had been restructured and sold within 3 years of his arrival. Each company had bled employees and shuttered divisions, but the shareholders had walked away richer. He didn't build, he gutted. He was profit without conscience, and I had just handed him a reason to see me as disposable. Around midnight, I called Leonard Blake, the board's chairman and one of my father's oldest allies. His voice was groggy when he answered, but the exhaustion sharpened into alarm as I explained what had happened. "He fired you during the memorial?" Leonard sounded almost breathless. "Aria, I had no idea. He told the board you'd gone silent, missed critical deadlines." "While burying my mother," I cut in. "He knew I was on approved leave. HR had the documentation, he just didn't care." There was a long pause. "Good God, I'll call an emergency session first thing Monday." "Make it official," I said. "As majority shareholder, I want to exercise my right to request a full board review of his leadership." He hesitated. "Aria, are you sure you want to do this? It'll be public. Messy." "He chose the battleground," I said quietly. "I'm just choosing the weapon." When I hung up, Ethan was watching me from the hallway, barefoot, wearing that look he gets when he's equal parts proud and terrified. "You're going after him, aren't you?" he asked. "No," I said, closing the folder. "I'm going after what's mine." I didn't sleep. Instead, I built a timeline: emails, HR approvals, screenshots of Victor's messages, and his restructuring bulletins. Every document told a story of arrogance disguised as efficiency. The next morning, I called Mara Chen, the HR director who had approved my bereavement leave. She answered in a whisper, like she was afraid someone might be listening. "Aria, they're cleaning house," she said. "Half the compliance team is gone. He's replacing senior staff with consultants from his old firm." "Mara, save everything," I said. "Every memo, every signature. We'll need it." She hesitated. "What are you planning?" "Accountability," I replied. "In writing." After the call, I sat back and stared at my reflection in the laptop screen. I looked older than I had 2 days ago. The kind of older that grief carves in deep lines you can't see but can feel every time you breathe. But behind that exhaustion was something new. Resolve. My father had built Solyra on faith in people. Victor had turned it into a machine. On Monday morning, that machine would meet the engineer's daughter. Monday came with a sun too bright for what I planned to do. I dressed with deliberate precision, choosing a black suit my mother used to call my armor, paired with her silver locket, my only reminder that decency could survive corporate warfare. Ethan offered to drive me, but I declined. I wanted to arrive alone, on my own terms. The Solyra Tower shimmered against the Seattle skyline, its mirrored surface reflecting the morning light like a weapon polished for battle. As I stepped through the glass doors, the receptionist gave me a hesitant smile, unaware of the storm I carried. I rode the elevator to the 32nd floor in silence, watching the digital numbers rise one by one, each chime a countdown to reckoning. The boardroom hadn't changed since the last quarterly review, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay, the table a perfect oval of polished oak. I had sat here many times before, usually along the wall as an observer, while men like Victor Crane filled the air with jargon and confidence. Today, my seat was at the center. Thomas from legal nodded to me cautiously. Leonard Blake sat at the head of the table, his expression grave but steady. Thank you for coming on short notice, he said to the room. We have urgent business regarding recent leadership conduct. Victor arrived last, perfectly on time, exuding the kind of smug composure only people unfamiliar with consequence can maintain. His charcoal suit was immaculate, his tie a precise Windsor knot, his smirk surgical. Ah, Aria, he said with mock warmth. Glad you could join us. I trust you've had time to process Friday's transition? Transition. That word again. His euphemism for carnage. I smiled thinly. I processed it. Good, he said, turning toward Leonard. Perhaps we can start. I assume this meeting concerns the restructuring plan I circulated? Leonard cleared his throat. Not exactly. It concerns your handling of personnel, specifically Ms. Monroe's termination. Victor's eyes flicked toward me, amusement replacing curiosity. That? A simple HR matter. She was unresponsive for weeks during a major product phase. Unfortunate. Timing, but necessary. Unfortunate timing, I repeated softly. Is that what you call firing someone during their mother's memorial service? The room fell silent. Even the hum of the air vents seemed to stop. Victor blinked, the first crack in his veneer. I wasn't aware of the circumstances, he said, voice tight. My decision was strictly operational. You weren't aware? I reached into my briefcase and placed a folder on the table. Because HR was. My leave was approved in writing. You received the memo 2 weeks prior. I slid the document across to him, watching his jaw tighten as he scanned the signature at the bottom. His own. He looked up, attempting recovery. Regardless, prolonged absence at this level is unacceptable. Prolonged, I cut in. 3 weeks of bereavement leave to bury the woman who co-founded this company, the same woman whose face still hangs in the lobby. Leonard shifted uncomfortably. Across the table, Dana Ruiz scribbled notes on a legal pad, her expression unreadable. I leaned forward. You know, Victor, there's something poetic about timing. You fired me the moment I stopped speaking at my mother's service. It was almost choreographed. His mask slipped again, replaced by the kind of anger men like him confuse with authority. This is irrelevant. I don't answer to sentimentality. I let the silence hang before dropping my next card. No, but you do answer to shareholders, and as of this morning, I represent 41.7% of Solyra's voting stock. His head jerked slightly, disbelief flickering before he masked it. That's impossible, he said. Those shares are in the Harmon estate. They were, I replied, sliding another document toward him. Until probate transferred them to me 5 years ago. You would have known that if you'd read the company's SEC filings. A murmur spread through the board. Leonard exhaled heavily, confirming it with a nod. She's correct, Victor. Aria holds the largest individual stake in Solyra Dynamics. Victor went pale, then forced a laugh too brittle to sound human. So what? You think that gives you the right to challenge executive decisions? No, I said calmly. It gives me the right to call a vote of no confidence. The words hit like a gunshot. Leonard straightened, Dana stopped writing, and Gregory from legal raised an eyebrow, intrigued. You can't be serious, Victor said, his voice rising. Over one HR decision? No, I replied. Over what that decision represents, your pattern of reckless cruelty, your disregard for ethical governance, and your complete failure to understand the soul of this company. I opened my laptop and projected a chart onto the screen. Retention rates, employee satisfaction, the decline in morale since his arrival. You call this efficiency, I continued. I call it rot. Victor slammed his hand against the table. You're making a spectacle of your grief. I met his gaze, unflinching. You fired me for grieving, so yes, I suppose I am. Leonard's voice cut through the tension. All those in favor of a formal vote? Hands rose. 1, 2, then nearly all. When Leonard's joined them, it was over. The motion carried. Victor's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Gregory slid a sealed envelope toward him. Your severance package, he said quietly. Victor stood, trembling with rage. "You think this is justice?" I stood too, closing my laptop with deliberate finality. "No," I said, "this is consequence." As security escorted him out, I caught his reflection in the window. Diminished, no longer invincible. I didn't feel triumph, only clarity. My father's words echoed in my mind. When this company forgets that people matter more than numbers, you'll know what to do. Now I finally had. When Victor Crane left the building that day, the silence he left behind was heavier than his presence had ever been. For years, his kind of leadership had taught everyone to keep their heads down, to avoid becoming the next casualty. Now that fear had evaporated, replaced by something unfamiliar, cautious hope. I could feel it in the hallway as I walked out of the boardroom, the quiet shuffle of employees who had watched through glass walls, unsure if they'd just witnessed a miracle or a massacre. Leonard caught up with me before I reached the elevator. "Aria," he said softly, "the board wants you to take the interim CEO position." His voice was gentle, as though afraid I might shatter after what I'd done. I looked at him, thinking of my father, of my mother's picture still hanging in the lobby, and of everything I had sacrificed for a company that had forgotten its own humanity. "No," I said, "I don't want the title. I want change." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded as if he understood that what I sought couldn't be written into an employment contract. That evening, I returned to the office alone. The city had gone dark except for the steady hum of neon from the harbor. I walked the halls my parents had once built from nothing, the labs where my father's prototypes came to life, the research floors where my mother fought for ethical AI design. Everything smelled of sterile ambition and old dust. It hit me how far Solyra had drifted from the dream that started it. I sat at my old desk, turned on the lamp, and began writing. Not a resignation, but a proposal. The first clause created a new executive code of conduct. No major policy affecting benefits, or leave could pass without board review and shareholder input. The second promoted Mara Chen to Senior Vice President of Human Resources. She was the only one who had treated my loss with humanity. The third outlined something I hadn't known I needed until that moment, a memorial space for employees who'd lost loved ones. Called it Aria's Haven, though I planned to remove my name later. It would be a rooftop garden, open year-round, a quiet refuge above the noise. When I presented it to Leonard the next morning, he read every word twice before speaking. "You realize this is more than a proposal," he said. "It's a manifesto." I shrugged. Then maybe it's time Solyra remembered what it stands for. Within weeks, the company began to shift. Departments once ruled by fear started talking again. HR rebuilt trust with transparency reports. We reinstated family leave for contractors and implemented counseling programs. And above us, construction began on the rooftop garden. When the first flowers bloomed 3 months later, I stood there in the wind, surrounded by the hum of the city and the smell of jasmine, and for the first time since my mother's death, I felt something close to peace. I hadn't destroyed Solyra. I'd rebuilt it from its own ashes. Change rarely announces itself with fanfare. It begins quietly, like a draft under a closed door. In the months after the boardroom vote, Solyra felt different. Not louder or busier, just more alive. People smiled in the hallways again. Departments that once competed began collaborating. Even the late-night engineers, who used to eat dinner alone at their desks, started leaving early to see their families. It wasn't about productivity anymore. It was about balance. Aria's Haven opened that spring, a rooftop garden filled with soft lights and silver benches that caught the morning sun. Employees began bringing their lunches up there, sharing stories of the people they'd lost and the ones they were still fighting for. Sometimes I'd stand by the railing listening. I never spoke during those moments. I didn't need to. Their peace was proof enough that the company had begun to heal. But healing doesn't end at the walls of one building. It travels. One afternoon, I received an email from a woman named Olivia Sanders. She'd worked for a manufacturing firm in Oregon and had been fired while her husband underwent cancer treatment. Her supervisor claimed her absence interfered with production efficiency. Her message was short, desperate, written in plain words that carried the weight of humiliation. "I don't want revenge," she wrote. I just want my job back. I remembered the helplessness I'd felt reading Victor Crane's message, that hollow disbelief that someone could reduce your humanity to a line item. I couldn't ignore her. I made a few calls, found out her company had just secured a contract with one of Solyra's subsidiaries. The next day, their HR director received an unexpected reminder about our new ethical compliance standards, specifically how supplier relationships could be terminated for labor violations. By Friday, Olivia was reinstated with full back pay and an apology letter she framed in her living room. Word spread faster than I expected. Emails began, arriving from across the country. Workers fired for caregiving, parents punished for loss, employees erased for being inconvenient. I couldn't save everyone, but I could shine a light on patterns of cruelty disguised as policy. Within a year, Solyra's foundation was quietly funding legal aid for cases like Olivia's. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was reform. Somewhere in Montana, I heard, Victor Crane was consulting for a small real estate firm, his name absent from headlines for the first time in decades. I felt no satisfaction, only a muted acknowledgement that justice had a rhythm of its own. Some people learn empathy only when they lose everything that once made them powerful. 10 years later, I stood in Aria's haven beneath a canopy of magnolias that hadn't existed when I first imagined this place. The garden had become more than a rooftop refuge. It was a living symbol of what survival could look like when turned toward others. The air smelled of soil and possibility, and the city shimmered below, unaware of how much had changed because one woman refused to stay silent. I was there for the dedication of the Monroe Compassion Act, federal legislation ensuring job protection for caregivers and grieving families. Lawmakers called it a landmark victory. I called it closure. As I spoke to the gathered crowd, employees, families, board members, people whose lives had been rebuilt through compassion, I felt my mother's presence everywhere, in the laughter, the stillness, the way the wind touched my hair. Toward the back stood a familiar figure, older now, humbled, hands folded before him, Victor Crane. He approached quietly after the ceremony, his voice low but steady. "You were right," he said. "Power means nothing if you use it to wound." I met his gaze, no anger left, only understanding that regret was its own kind of punishment. "And compassion," I replied, "means everything when you use it to rebuild." He nodded, then left without another word. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I looked out over the garden and thought of my parents. They'd built Solyra to change the world. It took losing everything to remember how. Looking back, I realize revenge was never the real victory. It wasn't firing Victor Crane that gave me peace. It was reclaiming the dignity he tried to erase. What I learned through that fight is something I think about every day. Power doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from knowing when to rise quietly, methodically, and let your actions speak for you. The world doesn't always hand justice to those who deserve it. But when you build systems that make cruelty impossible, you create justice that lasts longer than anger ever could. For years, I believed silence was weakness, that staying calm made me invisible. But silence, when used deliberately, can be the sharpest knife, precise, patient, and devastating. It cuts through arrogance without leaving blood on your hands. Forgiveness, too, isn't about absolving the person who hurt you. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of wanting them to suffer. I didn't forgive Victor because he deserved it. I forgave him because I was done letting him rent space in my head. The lesson is simple but hard to live. You can't control what people do to you, but you can always control the story that comes after. In workplaces, relationships, even in daily frustrations, remember that retaliation burns fast, but rebuilding burns brighter. Use your anger as architecture, something that creates, not destroys. How to get started today. Write down one boundary you've been too afraid to enforce and honor it this week. Reach out to someone at work or in your life who's been overlooked and lift them up, even with a simple compliment. Reclaim one piece of yourself that someone tried to diminish. Your voice, your time, your worth. And most importantly, stay calm when cruelty tries to provoke you. Quiet resolve can be more terrifying than rage. If this story made you reflect on your own moment of injustice, tell me in the comments. Share it with someone who needs strength today, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about taking back your power, one choice at a time.